I'd just like to firstly thank the GRDC for my sponsorship and their support, and not only what they do here with capacity building with Nuffield, but also the work they do in Australia and around the world. It's instrumental in ensuring profitability for the future. I'd like to thank my wife Sophie. She's been fantastic, not only encouraging, but the support over the last few years while I've undertaken my Nuffield topic, and the patience of our children. It's a very difficult thing for our scholars to travel away from our families. You don't really ever get that time back, so you really want to make sure that you do it justice and you make the best use of it. So at home we grow a variety of dryland crops: sorghum, chickpea, corn, wheat, barley and mung beans. It's interesting, I didn't do that on purpose in that order, but if I look at that list, sorghum is definitely our pillar crop, and they're listed pretty well on gross revenue for our business. Why precision? The gap between average farm yields and attainable grain yields is between 50 and 100%. This is some work that was done, funded by the GRDC by Peter Wiley from AgriPath. We've been benchmarking with AgriPath for a number of years now, and essentially we measure the success of our farming system on a year-by-year basis, benchmarked against water use efficiency. So when I was awarded with my scholarship, it was a keen interest of mine, precision agriculture, and I wanted to combine how I could better utilise what we were doing in PA and simplify what we were doing with water use efficiency and nutrient use efficiency. So when I first started investigating where to go, I really wanted to look at similar climates and production systems to what I was familiar with in our own operations. So I went and met with this fellow on the left, Professor Bob Stewart. He's currently in a retiring capacity at West Texas A&M, but in his previous life he's headed up research departments on dryland agriculture in Kansas, Oklahoma and Bushland, where this is here in Texas. I thought I knew a fair bit about water use efficiency, and it was the first question that Bob asked me when I got there. He said, well, what do you know and why? So I started rattling off all the figures out of my head that we'd been using from our benchmarking. He said, well, that's all very interesting. He said, but why? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, righto, well, we'll spend the next week finding out why. So this is a theoretical grain yield equation, and very interestingly in Australia, the very last portion of this equation is harvest index, and it's invaluable to our farming systems to ensure that we've got enough moisture left over to fill grain at harvest time, because that's how we make our money. But often we forget the other parts of the equation, so I'll break this down and explain it a bit further. So the first portion is ET, which is evapotranspiration, which is the total amount of stored moisture in your profile that your plant has access to, combined with your in-crop rainfall. T over ET is the volume of water that is used for transpiration to grow the plant biomass out of the volume of available evapotranspiration. And then 1 over TR is the amount of water it takes to produce a set amount of above ground biomass. So we keep talking about biomass, and it's the predominant part of that equation is biomass production increases grain yield. But every time we do something to ensure harvest index is maintained, we start to take away from biomass. So when designing your farming systems, it's imperative to look at this equation and determining what you are actually trying to achieve and keeping this in mind. So we use a bit of technology to understand this on a broader scale. This is the 1985 to 2015 corn yields in the US and Canada. Now interestingly, as Bob explained to me, that seed companies love to take credit for increase in grain production. However, quite interestingly here, we see that this represents the previous formula, in that as we've increased biomass by increasing our seeding rates, at the same time we've also increased yield over that long term. So this was some of the work, and what I suppose had triggered the thought process for Bob was that in ancient times the native Indians in New Mexico, such a dry environment, to ensure the success of their corn crop and to make sure they had some grain, they would plant clusters. So they would take 10 or 15 corn seeds and put them into a pile and water them all together. Now, it was observed that not every plant would succeed and grow a usable ear of corn, but there was always at least one. So it's understanding the interaction of these plants with one another and how they can affect the climate within their own microclimate zone. If you have a look on the bottom right, it's a picture of two precision seeding discs. And this is a fantastic way, if you have a precision seeder, to look at, cost effectively look at your farming system to ensure that your population and row spacing is maximising your yield. What they've done here to create these clusters in a normal planting situation is they've taken one disc and blanked out quarters of the disc using silicon, and to mimic the same population in the row beside it, they've just taken out every second hole. So where's technology come into this? This was picked up, this picture was developed by Planet Labs in their earlier days from Stanford University. I got it from a professor there called David Lobel. And it clearly shows where the grain yield is coming from. The increase in that grain yield is showing in this photo that it's actually coming out of the high yielding zones, not necessarily out of the lower zones, as we can see the diagram to the left shifts. This is a long-term picture of Indiana, Iowa and Illinois. So I travelled up to Spectrum Technologies at Aurora, just outside of Chicago. I'd met with one of their people in California, and interestingly enough, this is how quickly the ag space changes. But within the few weeks between me meeting this fellow and organising the meeting, by the time I got to Chicago to meet with him, he no longer worked for the company. He'd moved down the road for a better pay packet. And anyone that's travelled to the US and tried to get meetings know that you don't just walk in the door. There's security on the front of these buildings, and this happened to me a number of times, but you'd be knocking on the door and waiting for someone to come in to allow you in through the front door. I was very lucky there. I spent some time with David Lau. He heads up Spectrum's international sales division, works all over the world, and I asked him about the company. It's 35 years they've been producing sensor technology and working with the Internet of Things. And he said initially they started out with observation, trying to give farmers better information around soil moisture. And to do that, they had sensors, remote sensors in fields collecting data. But what they realised over time was that initially, once they developed the sensing technology, it could be more cheaply replicated out of China. And so they worked direct source with some of those companies, and they started to look at analysis. But he said the real value was not in the analysis, but it was in the actions that you could then go and perform once you had the correct data. This is Levy's law of minimum. It's very interesting because in a low water producing system, we often say, oh, well, I didn't get enough rain this year, or my water holding capacity in my soil is not quite good enough. But often farmers create the limiting factors with poor nutrition and poor soil condition, results of long-term poor farming methods. So I looked at how this could be playing an effect in our farming system, and I did note that we had a number of these that needed to be addressed to maximise our water use efficiency. So I spent some time in Brazil. We were fortunate, we had our CSC there last year, and at the time we went out to an Embrapa site, and amelioration's it's an interesting thing. We all have seen the data, and I think we've seen some plenty of evidence that shows massive improvements in productivity from amelioration, but it's quite expensive. And this was a great representation. If you can get everything right, that what is possible. In Formosa, where this was taken, this photo, there's basically no nutrition. It has very, very poor soil condition. There's 1,200 millimetres a year in rainfall. And so this was a P deficiency trial, or phosphorus deficiency trial, so there's varying amounts of phosphorus added to the crop, but everything else had been done here. And it just represents what can happen to productivity if you have a limitation, and in this case a major limitation, in your farming system. We often get the results from our fields on a yearly basis, and we look at the average of the field, the average yield. When we plan for the next year, we average the amount of nutrition we're going to put into the field, or we average the plant population across the field. And I understand this is starting to change and people are looking at it, but the reality is that when I looked at this field, and if I treat it as average, even being very generous with a plus minus 10% deviation, the reality was that average only represented 31.8% of the field. So I understood I was probably losing fertiliser, and I was missing a fair bit of upside in crop production. You can see that the flat line in this diagram represents treating the field as average, and if we go back to Levy's law of minimum, I've started to create a hell of a lot of limitations within my farming system by underestimating plant available water and by over-applicating fertiliser and nutrition where it's not needed, but also under-treat areas of higher production. So it comes back to a risk factor. We have environmental risk of loss. We have financial risk of not making enough or overspending and spending too much. And we can see just purely on a 5-zone management system what's achievable. It's an enormous difference in total tonnage on the management zone against the average. But the possibilities are now infinite if you're prepared to let go and you consider some of the options out there. We can continue to move beyond those zones and allow our technology and our own data to drive our equipment to improve even further. This is actually an applied urea map that we use on our farm, which is fed in from Echelon. We use backdated number of layers of data, but essentially we can utilise NDVI, weather modelling, harvest yield data, all in conjunction together to give us a more transparent view of what we're doing, but also maximise our productivity, reduce our financial risk, and ensure that we're not sending anything down the creek to disrupt our environment. So which one do I choose? There's so many platforms out there now, but the idea was to keep it simple. I've gone from spending 2 days to create a prescription map to paying $5 a hectare to get somebody else to do it. And it turns up and I plug it in the tractor and away I go. I didn't want to spend any more money. We felt we were already investing enough into our farming system, so we don't do anything any differently, but we just treat each area as it should be treated. And I don't like big terms, and a couple of pearlers are data silos and mega data. And I really like this. The most overlooked silo is your brain. The years of penned entries from your diary How are we going to keep this information relevant and pass it through into the digital age? And megadata, if it doesn't have a geo-reference, it can't be used. Start with the big picture and don't sweat the small stuff. I thought this is very fitting to have the photo with the big thinker himself, Abe Lincoln. Thank you very much.